Have you noticed how debates about migration or Islam sometimes get completely out of control? Discussions quickly become emotional and polarized. But why does this happen? To understand this, we need to take a step back. Today we will look at something that often stays invisible: how the knowledge and the facts behind these debates are actually produced. Because the key to the problem often lies in this process. Usually everything starts quite harmlessly, with a question that we have all heard before in the media or in political talk shows. At first glance, the question sounds neutral and reasonable. For example, a classic question like this: is Islam compatible with democracy? It forces us to choose between two sides, as if there were only one correct answer. But here comes the important twist. Instead of searching for the answer, let us look at the question itself. What does such a question actually do? What happens to a group of people when they are constantly observed and repeatedly asked to position themselves in this way? Quite simply, it turns them into an object of investigation. They become a problem that must be analyzed, measured, and somehow solved. In this process, the complexity of real lives disappears. Individual experiences and contradictions are reduced to one general answer. Let's go one step deeper and look at how this supposedly objective knowledge is produced. You could almost call it a factory of facts. The most important tool in this factory is something called a category. Think of it like a drawer in which people are placed. The important point is this: these drawers are not natural laws. They are created. Scientists define groups for research, politicians define groups for policies, and the media use categories to simplify complex realities. This process often follows the same pattern. First, a topic is defined as a problem, for example, lack of integration. Second, a group of people is identified as relevant to this problem. Third, this group is studied, surveyed, counted, and turned into statistics. These results are then presented as objective facts and used in political debates or decisions. But there is something hidden in this process: the standard of comparison. Every measurement needs a reference point, a norm. This norm represents what is considered normal. The interesting part is that this norm is rarely questioned or examined. It simply remains invisible. The feminist scholar Donna Haraway described this with a powerful idea called the view from nowhere. This describes a perspective that claims to be completely neutral and objective. From this position, others are defined and categorized, but the person doing the categorizing remains invisible and unnamed. This is a very powerful position. This dynamic becomes even stronger when another factor enters the discussion: security. When security becomes the main concern, observation can turn into surveillance. Since the attacks of September 11, 2001, the way knowledge about Muslims is produced has changed significantly. Questions about social life and belonging have increasingly been replaced by a security perspective. Suddenly, an entire population group is often seen primarily as a potential risk that must be managed. You can see this clearly in the types of questions asked in surveys. While the majority population is asked about everyday concerns or political opinions, Muslims are often asked to prove their loyalty, explain their views on global conflicts, or distance themselves from violence. This security perspective has real consequences. Governments start to decide which interpretations of religion are acceptable and which are considered extremist. People are expected to publicly distance themselves from actions they have nothing to do with. In some cases, scholars are even called to court to interpret the beliefs of individuals. But what does this constant inspection do to the people who are affected? And what does it do to public debate? It often begins with the feeling of constantly being questioned. People feel that their belonging, their lifestyle, and even their loyalty to the country are under suspicion. This creates enormous pressure. People feel forced to explain and justify themselves all the time. They must react to a framework they did not choose. Some respond by emphasizing that Islam is peaceful. Others react with frustration or resistance. But in both cases, they are still responding to the same imposed narrative. The result is often emotional exhaustion. One researcher described how one of her interview partners spoke about a deep personal burden. People become tired of constantly being held responsible for the actions of others. And for society as a whole, The result is deeper divisions and more polarized debates. This brings us to the central point of this analysis. The process we described often happens without obvious hatred or bad intentions. The researchers, journalists, or politicians involved do not have to be racist. In many cases, they actually want to understand and inform, but they are still part of a structure that produces these effects. The important insight is this: counting and measuring people is never completely neutral. It always shapes reality. It creates the categories it claims to describe and changes the people who are being measured. This leads to the central thesis: dehumanization does not begin with hatred. It begins much earlier. It begins when a person becomes the object of constant observation, when the human being behind the numbers disappears, when someone is no longer seen as an individual with a complex story, but only as a representative of a category, a data point in a statistic, or a potential risk to be managed. So here is a final question you might want to think about. The next time you see a survey or follow a heated debate, try to look beyond the content. Ask yourself, who is being measured here? And even more importantly, who remains invisible while holding the ruler? Today's discussion was based on research by Amir Moazzami, 2014. If you have questions or topic suggestions, feel free to write to YouTube at EmpowerMigra.com. EmpowerMigra, understanding begins with listening.